I thought the sound was gunfire. That's how loud the pounding was, rhythmic, metallic, and way too close. I shot up from bed, tripped over my dog, and peered out the window, only to see 3 construction workers jamming steel fence posts into the banks of my creek like they were staking a vampire. And there she was, Karen, perched on a folding chair like a vulture in yoga pants, barking orders and sipping a green smoothie the color of swamp muck. At 6:45 in the morning. On my land. I opened the window to shout, but she beat me to it, yelling, "You're welcome! We're beautifying your swamp." That's the moment I realized. Karen had officially declared war on my property, and she brought reinforcements. The creek has always been more than just water to me. It runs through the back of my land, framed by overhanging cottonwoods and wildflowers. It's where my granddad taught me how to fish and where my dog, Mabel, learned how to chase frogs and miss every single one. I'd never had a problem with neighbors before, not until Karen moved in 3 months ago. At first, it was the usual HOA-type antics, passive-aggressive notes about mailbox height, complaints about my American flag being too faded, and constant reminders that my fence clashed with the community theme. I ignored her. Most people did. But today was different. Today she was physically fencing off the creek. I stormed outside in my pajama pants and boots, looking like a survivalist who just woke up from a decade-long nap. Karen greeted me with a wave and a laminated packet in hand. "Good morning," she chirped. "This is just a temporary enhancement for HOA-approved beautification. We're making the area more meditative." I squinted at her. "This is my creek." She didn't flinch. "Actually, it runs through communal visibility zones per the HOA's bylaws. And since it lacks structure and flow symmetry, we've voted to enclose it for community betterment." I stared at her like she had 3 heads. "Visibility zones?" She nodded, smug. "Page 43, Section 6.2.2. Now, I've read the HOA rules. I know them better than she does because I once represented myself in a small claims dispute involving a chicken coop. There is no Section 6.2.2. But Karen's confidence was bulletproof. And worse, she'd brought a crew that didn't care whose name was on the deed. They were already halfway through fencing off both ends of the creek, hammering, measuring, and installing what looked like anti-tank barriers for water. "What happens when the wildlife can't get through?" I asked, pointing at a nervous-looking family of ducks now stranded on the wrong side. Karen clucked her tongue. "Well, then they'll learn boundaries, won't they?" Mabel barked like she was ready to call in an airstrike. I went back inside, grabbed my phone, and called Dean. Dean is a retired game warden who smells like cedar and always carries jerky in his pocket. He's also my neighbor, fishing buddy, and one of the few people who understand the significance of that creek. "You're gonna want to come see this," I said. 10 minutes later, Dean rolled up in his beat-up Ford, stepped out with a chew in his lip, and whistled low when he saw the fence. "Holy hell," he muttered. "She fenced off the whole damn thing? Claimed it's for community meditation." He chuckled darkly. "She's gonna need a lawyer and a priest." Then his face changed. He squatted down near the water's edge, pulled out a pocket magnifier, and examined the muddy bank. He looked up at me with something close to panic. "Do you know what this is?" he asked. A bad day?" "No. This," he pointed at the creek, "is a federally protected steelhead spawning tributary. Has been since '94. I used to tag fish here for the state. There are sensors buried up and downstream to monitor flow, sediment levels, and spawning patterns." I blinked. "What does that mean?" "It means your HOA queen over there just fenced off a federally monitored habitat. That's not just illegal. That's felony-level illegal." We both turned to watch Karen directing a worker to install a faux bamboo trellis over the creek like she was redecorating a spa, not interfering with a natural ecosystem. Dean stood up slowly. "You need to call Fish and Wildlife. Today." I didn't waste time. I emailed the Regional Enforcement Office, attached photos, location data, and a video of Karen dramatically shooing away a group of kids who had come down to look for tadpoles. By sundown, I'd heard back. The email was brief and alarming. "Thank you for the report. Our agents are aware of the site and will conduct an investigation immediately. Any obstruction of federally protected waterways is subject to enforcement under Title 16 of the U.S. Code." Karen had no idea what she'd done. The next day, she doubled down. She hosted a small gathering for what she called the Creekfront Visualization Initiative. Guests arrived in white linen outfits and brought crystals. They meditated near the newly installed Serenity fence, which now included hanging lanterns, inspirational signs, and a wind chime shaped like a lotus flower. One lady asked Karen if the creek had healing properties. Karen nodded solemnly and said, "It used to. But I'm cleansing it from the chaos now." That was the final straw. Dean and I walked over around dusk, just as the last of the white linen crowd floated off in Priuses. I politely asked Karen to take down the fence before it was taken down for her. She laughed in my face. "You can't do anything. The HOA owns the community aesthetic. That includes the creek." I raised an eyebrow. "Even if it's federal land?" She paused. "What?" Dean smiled, holding up a laminated photo of a steelhead tagged with a GPS tracker. "Congratulations," he said. "You just blocked a federally protected migration path." Karen blinked like a malfunctioning robot. "No, that's not, there's no way, I read every. This is private property." "Not anymore," I said. As we walked away, I could practically hear the foundations of her world cracking. And this was just the beginning. 2 days later, the fence was still up, and so was Karen's ego. If anything, she had doubled down. A new sign had been staked into the ground near the edge of the creek that read, "Private Reflection Area, HOA Access Only." She'd even added a pair of folding chairs and a cheap stone fountain that trickled awkwardly into a bucket. It was clear Karen believed she was winning some kind of spiritual turf war, and in her mind, she was the undisputed goddess of it all. What she didn't know was that forces far beyond our sleepy neighborhood were now involved. And they weren't coming to sip green smoothies. Early that morning, Dean called me with a voice that barely disguised his excitement. The Fish and Wildlife agents had responded. Not only were they aware of the creek's status, but they were also planning an on-site inspection, today. Apparently, my photo evidence had been circulated around the regional office, and it raised enough eyebrows to trigger a field visit. Dean told me to act normal. I told him acting normal while watching federal agents sneak up on a suburban fence was not in my skill set. Around noon, a white unmarked SUV rolled slowly into the neighborhood. It passed Karen's house once, circled the block, and then came to a stop a few houses down from mine. Out stepped 2 men and 1 woman, all dressed like biology professors on vacation, khaki pants, utility vests, and serious faces. One of them carried what looked like a case for a musical instrument, but I had a feeling it didn't contain a violin. I watched from the porch, pretending to be absorbed in trimming hedges. Dean stood across the street, pretending to restring his fishing rod. The agents moved casually toward the creek like birdwatchers until they saw the fence. Then they stopped cold. One of them actually muttered, "You've got to be kidding me." Karen must have seen them from her window, because she appeared seconds later, striding toward the creek like she owned it, and everything within a 100-mile radius. "Can I help you?" she asked, blocking their path with a clipboard and a smile she probably practiced in the mirror. One of the agents flashed a badge. "U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, ma'am. We're conducting an inspection related to a reported obstruction of a federally protected waterway." Karen blinked. "This is HOA-regulated land. You need clearance from the board." The female agent stepped forward. "We're responding to a violation of the Endangered Species Act and the Clean Water Act. That supersedes local homeowners association rules." Karen snorted. "Oh please. That little puddle doesn't even run year-round." The agent's face didn't change. This puddle is a registered spawning site for Oncorhynchus micus, an endangered species of steelhead trout. Any obstruction of their habitat is a federal offense." Karen's face did a thing, twisted somewhere between disbelief and outrage, like someone had just told her Whole Foods was closing. "I want to speak to your supervisor," she snapped. "He's already watching," the male agent said, nodding to a man further upstream who was busy taking photos and using a portable scanner to examine sediment levels near the fence post. Then came the fun part. The agents walked directly onto the creekside and began dismantling the fence, methodically, piece by piece. One used a bolt cutter, another catalogued the items removed, and the third agent pulled out what looked like a portable antenna. Within moments, a high-pitched tone began to beep rapidly. The female agent looked up at Karen. "You see this signal? That's one of the buried transmitters. Your fencing triggered a data disruption last week. We logged it." Karen's face lost all its usual color. "No one told me about any transmitters." "You didn't ask," the agent replied coolly. I had to bite my cheek to stop from laughing. The entire neighborhood had started paying attention now. People were peeking from windows, hovering near their mailboxes, and pretending to water lawns. The sight of federal agents pulling down Karen's private reflection area was something none of us had ever dared to dream. And here it was, live. Karen tried one last act of desperation. "This is outrageous. You're destroying property. The HOA paid for that fence." "Which will be factored into the fine," one agent replied. "You'll receive a notice in the mail. It'll include restoration costs, habitat disruption penalties, and possible criminal charges depending on how much concrete was used." That's when Karen made her fatal move. She lunged toward one of the agents and grabbed the bolt cutters from his hands. "You can't take this down. It's part of my design." The agents didn't even flinch. They calmly took back the tool, informed her that interfering with a federal investigation was an additional charge, and advised her to stand aside. When she refused, they called in the county sheriff for backup. By the time a cruiser pulled into the cul-de-sac 15 minutes later, Karen had begun screeching about overreach and communist infiltration. She was politely escorted to her home and warned that any further obstruction could result in immediate arrest. The fence was fully removed by late afternoon. The only thing left behind was a small white sign reading, "Federal Property. Do not disturb," and a set of tiny metal stakes marking protected monitoring points. The fallout was immediate. That evening, an emergency HOA meeting was called, and for the first time since Karen seized control, the board actually listened to the homeowners. Apparently, they'd had enough of the drama, the unauthorized expenditures, and the sudden unwanted attention from federal agencies. Several board members resigned on the spot. Karen was suspended pending investigation into misuse of HOA fund. I didn't say much at that meeting. I didn't need to. The creek was back, the fence was gone, and Karen's iron grip had cracked. Dean toasted me later that night with a lukewarm beer and a satisfied smirk. "You know what the best part is," he said. "What's that?" "This isn't even over yet." He was right. Karen still had tricks up her sleeve. But now, she wasn't just up against me. She was up against the federal government and nature itself. And neither of them forgives easily. Karen did what Karen always does when she doesn't get her way, she escalated. Within a day of the fence being torn down and her public humiliation reaching critical mass, she'd found a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, either. This one arrived in a bright blue Tesla with tinted windows and license plates that read Bylaw 1. Out stepped a man in a lavender suit, slicked back hair, and teeth so white they could signal ships. His name was Bryce Hawthorne, and according to the HOA rumor mill, he'd made his fortune defending shady developers and suing cities over aesthetic discrepancies. In other words, the perfect match for Karen's brand of delusion. They made their entrance like royalty, Karen at his side with an overflowing binder of complaints and Bryce smiling like he'd already won the case. They marched straight into the HOA's temporary clubhouse, which was just a poorly ventilated room behind the community pool, and announced their intent to sue for unauthorized government intrusion and emotional damages caused by environmental interference. He even used the phrase, egregious overreach by federal tree huggers. The man was practically allergic to logic. I wasn't surprised when I received a letter later that evening. Certified mail, hand-delivered to my porch, addressed in gold ink no less. Inside was a formal neighborhood grievance filed by Karen, claiming I had conspired with outside authorities to undermine local governance and endangered the peaceful energy of the community. She was accusing me of being too connected to nature. Imagine that. She also requested a restraining order, citing that my proximity to the creek was causing her daily emotional distress and hydration imbalance. I laughed out loud. Then I poured myself a drink and waited for the court date to be confirmed. It didn't take long. Within 48 hours, we were scheduled for a hearing at the county courthouse. Not a full-blown trial, but enough of a spectacle to get Karen frothing at the mouth and digging into her personal collection of printed emails and low-resolution satellite photos. I wore jeans and a clean shirt. Karen showed up in a full white pantsuit and an American flag scarf, looking like she was running for HOA president of the entire planet. Bryce strutted in behind her like a peacock, briefcase in hand, ready to sue the world. The courtroom wasn't packed, but there were enough curious neighbors in the pews to make it feel like a small-town drama. And at the front of it all sat Judge Rosalind Keene, sharp-eyed, silver-haired, and completely unimpressed by nonsense. Bryce opened with a speech that sounded more like a campaign ad than a legal argument. He accused Fish and Wildlife of fabricating data, claimed that the creek was spiritually stagnant, and even implied that the federal agents had personal vendettas against decorative fencing. Karen nodded along dramatically, holding up photos of the creek pre-fence and post-fence as if they were crime scene evidence. One of the photos showed me fishing. She claimed it was proof of hostile territorial behavior. Then it was my turn. I stood, handed over the email correspondence with the federal office, the original deed to the land, and a printed copy of the creek's environmental protection designation, complete with maps and registration numbers. The judge took one look at the documents and raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Hawthorne," she said slowly, "are you aware that this stream is on a federal registry of endangered species habitats?" Bryce straightened his lavender tie. "Your Honor, that registry is outdated and subject to local zoning overrides." "It was updated last year," I said, trying not to grin. The judge flipped through the pages. "I also see that your client submitted HOA documents claiming communal rights to land clearly marked as private on the county survey." Karen tried to interrupt. "But the creek runs behind multiple properties. It's clearly visible to others." "Visibility is not the same as ownership," Judge Keene replied. "And even if it were, that doesn't give you the right to alter or obstruct a federally monitored ecosystem." Karen opened her mouth again, but the judge raised a hand. "Ma'am, this is a hearing, not a town hall. Please control your outbursts." Then came the twist. Judge Keene invited a representative from Fish and Wildlife to provide testimony. I didn't even know they were coming. The agent stepped forward, tall, composed, and wearing the same windbreaker from the creek inspection. She introduced herself and proceeded to lay out, in no uncertain terms, just how severe the situation was. Karen hadn't just installed a fence. She'd driven metal posts into a spawning ground, blocked access to native trout species, tampered with a federally monitored waterway, and disrupted sensor equipment that collects data for both the state and national databases. The room went silent. Even Bryce stopped smiling. But it didn't end there. The agent also brought up the unauthorized landscaping, concrete poured near the banks, foreign decorative stones, and non-native plants that could potentially choke out local vegetation. She mentioned fines, restoration demands, and even, depending on ongoing investigations, possible criminal charges under environmental protection laws. Karen started to sputter. But I didn't know. No one told me it was federal. You were told the day the fence was taken down, the judge said calmly. You chose to proceed with legal action anyway. And with that, the decision came swiftly. The judge ruled in my favor, dismissed the restraining order, and ordered Karen to cease and desist any further interaction with the creek or surrounding habitat. She also noted that any additional tampering would result in a referral to the U.S. Attorney's Office. But then came the cherry on top. Karen was slapped with a $45,000 fine. Not just for the damage to the creek, but for the illegal use of HOA funds to install the fence, host events, and hire an attorney without a board vote. The courtroom gasped. Bryce's jaw actually dropped. Karen's face went through 5 shades of disbelief before settling on a pale shade of rage. As we left the courthouse, Dean patted me on the back. Well, that went about as well as a creek blessing with dynamite. Karen, on the other hand, stormed to her Tesla, peeled out of the parking lot, and screamed something that sounded like, "This isn't over." And for once, she was right. Because when Karen's back is against the wall, she doesn't surrender. She gets weird. And that's exactly what she did next. The problem with Karen wasn't that she lost. It was that she couldn't stand losing publicly. After the courtroom blowout, she vanished for a couple of days. No morning walks, no yoga grunts from the backyard, not even her usual HOA-wide email blasts about driveway oil stains and patriotic bunting violations. It was so quiet I almost started to worry. Almost. Then came the smell. Faint at first, like something artificial and wrong, hanging in the air just downstream from the creek. It smelled like concrete dust, burnt plastic, and Karen's perfume if it were turned into a candle called denial and regret. The next morning, Dean showed up at my place holding a fish in a bucket. The poor thing was floating belly up. Dean looked furious. This guy was flopping near the bank, then just stopped, he said. I think she poured something into the creek. We grabbed gloves and walked down to the area behind her property. That's when we saw it. Fresh cement, still damp, forming a little wall across a narrow bend of the stream. There was also a pile of broken cinder blocks nearby, a couple of empty concrete mix bags, and a plastic tub labeled water flow redirector that looked suspiciously like a repurposed mop bucket. Karen had tried to reroute the creek. Badly. She must have done it at night. The patchwork construction was crooked, sloppy, and clearly illegal. She hadn't just poured concrete into a protected fishery, she'd tried to change its entire path, probably in some delusional attempt to make it curve away from her property or stop the water from flowing altogether. This is sabotage, Dean muttered. I took pictures, recorded video, and emailed the agents from Fish and Wildlife again. But this time, I also posted a discreet message on a local community board that had become infamous for calling out HOA insanity. I included one image, just Karen's backyard, the creek, and the cement wall, no names. The post simply read, "When your neighbor loses in court and tries to rewire nature." It exploded overnight. The comments rolled in faster than I could read them. People were tagging local news stations, environmental watchdogs, and even a famous wildlife YouTuber. Someone made a meme of Karen in a hard hat labeled Queen of Creek Construction. Another turned the cement wall into a movie poster, Karen vs. Nature, the final wall. But the real twist came from the hidden cameras. Turns out, when the Fish and Wildlife agents had first inspected the creek, they'd reactivated some of the motion-triggered trail cams buried along the route. They weren't just there for wildlife, they were also used to monitor illegal dumping and environmental tampering. And one of them had caught Karen in full-on villain mode. The footage showed her dragging a wheelbarrow filled with bags of quick-set concrete. She was wearing night goggles, a headlamp, and what looked like a painter's jumpsuit. She slipped twice, cursed loudly both times, and at one point, hurled a bucket into the bushes when it wouldn't pour properly. She was also singing something that sounded like the national anthem but with the words, "My creek, my rules." When that footage was handed over to the agents, they didn't even respond with words. Just a one-line email, "We're on our way." The next morning, they showed up again. This time, they brought backup. 2 more agents, an environmental chemist, and a representative from the State Department of Fish and Game. It was like watching a SWAT team descend on a garden gnome convention. They cordoned off the area, began removing the concrete, and took soil and water samples. Karen came outside mid-process, still in her robe, and began screaming that they were trespassing with shovels. One of the agents calmly showed her the footage. Karen stared at the screen, jaw slack, then launched into a rant so incoherent that even the squirrels stopped and stared. She claimed the footage was deepfake, that someone had drugged her and forced her to pour concrete, and that she was actually testing a new landscaping product for erosion control. Then she demanded a lawyer, a representative from the HOA, and a spiritual medium who could confirm the creek had bad energy. She got none of the above. What she got instead was a formal arrest for tampering with a federally protected habitat. The agents didn't cuff her, but they did escort her off the property and into the back of one of their SUVs. The neighborhood watched from behind curtains, phones raised, jaws dropped. And then, as if the universe wasn't done with her, the footage leaked. I didn't do it. Neither did Dean. Someone from the community board must have gotten hold of it, or maybe it was a public records request that went viral. Either way, the video of Karen in night vision goggles trying to reroute a creek with dollar store tools hit the internet like a wrecking ball. It made it to Reddit, then Twitter, then local news. Within hours, it had its own hashtags. #CreekKaren, #ConcreteGate, and my personal favorite, #WetCementEnergy. The video ended up on a late-night talk show, reenacted with puppets. One of the hosts called it, "the most unhinged environmental sabotage since someone tried to vacuum the Grand Canyon." But it wasn't just social media. The HOA finally snapped. At an emergency board meeting, they voted unanimously to remove Karen from any position of authority, present or future. She was officially banned from participating in HOA meetings, committees, or decisions. Her email privileges were revoked, her card access to the community center was deactivated, and her name was removed from the community bulletin board. They even took down her lawn flamingos as a symbolic gesture. But the damage wasn't just social. Fish and Wildlife filed a report with the State Environmental Agency, who opened a separate investigation into her use of non-permitted materials. The concrete had seeped into a spawning pocket used by native fish, potentially endangering the ecosystem for years. There was talk of criminal prosecution, restoration mandates, and restitution payment. Karen was facing real consequences for the first time in her life. Meanwhile, the creek was being restored. A local conservation group volunteered to help with the cleanup, alongside the agents and biologists. Dean brought sandwiches and supervised like an old general watching a battlefield being reclaimed. I pitched in where I could, planting native grasses and hauling away debris. One afternoon, while we were rebuilding the bank, Dean looked over at me and grinned. "You realize she's probably planning a comeback, right?" he said. "She can try," I replied, wiping sweat from my brow. "But the creek doesn't forget. And neither did the internet." In the weeks that followed Karen's arrest, the neighborhood returned to something resembling peace, though peace is relative when you've lived through federal agents, court battles, and late-night creek sabotage. The restoration crew made good progress. With help from local volunteers, the cement was cleared, the bank was stabilized, and the water, once cloudy with Karen's powdered rage, ran clear again. The trout returned first, darting through the shallows like they'd been waiting just out of sight. Then came the herons, the frogs, and eventually the kids, who cautiously resumed their frog-chasing missions under strict adult supervision. Nature, as always, found a way. And Karen, for the moment, was gone. Her house sat strangely quiet. No flamingos, no signs, no HOA announcements taped to our doors. It was like the entire building was trying to forget its owner ever lived there. Occasionally, someone would mention seeing her through a window, pacing like a disgraced dictator waiting for a coup to reverse. She was officially banned from HOA meetings and on the hook for thousands in fines and restoration costs, not to mention whatever civil charges were coming down the pipeline. Most assumed she'd lay low. They underestimated her. One afternoon, I came back from the creek to find a letter tucked under my door. Not mailed, not typed, handwritten in loopy cursive on floral stationery that reeked of lavender perfume. It was from Karen. The letter began, "To my unkind neighbor," which set the tone nicely. She accused me of conspiring with federal agencies, of orchestrating a witch hunt against her, and of violating her spiritual boundaries with negative vibrations and weaponized wildlife. She claimed the concrete wall was a metaphor misunderstood by bureaucratic minds and warned that karma would eventually rebalance the scales. The last line read, "You may have won this battle, but the land speaks to me in ways it never will to you." I couldn't tell if it was a threat, a prophecy, or an unintentional poem. I showed it to Dean, who read it twice, laughed for 5 minutes straight, then framed it and hung it in his garage next to his fishing trophies. A few days later, we got word from the state environmental office. Karen had reached a settlement to avoid prosecution, but it required full payment of all restoration costs, public service hours related to conservation efforts, and a formal apology letter addressed to the community. That letter, when it finally came, was delivered to every mailbox in the neighborhood, printed on pink paper and signed in glitter pen. I regret if my actions were misunderstood by those unequipped to see the bigger picture, she wrote. While my intentions were always pure, the response to my landscaping vision has made clear that some minds remain tragically earthbound. She still didn't get it. But the damage had been done. She was stripped of her status, mocked online, fined, and forced into creek cleanup duty alongside the same agents who'd arrested her. Someone snapped a photo of her picking up trash in a reflective vest and posted it with the caption, "Creeksilla goes community." We thought that was the final act. But the universe wasn't quite finished. It started with an old stone Karen had knocked over when she built her doomed fence. At the time, no one thought much of it, just a weather-worn chunk of granite that had been buried under ivy and vines near the edge of the water. But during one of the final restoration days, Dean noticed something strange beneath the loosened dirt. It looked like a metal hinge. We started digging, careful not to disturb the creek, and eventually unearthed what looked like a small hatch. It was sealed shut, rusted over, and covered in moss. Dean stared at it like he'd just seen a ghost. "This can't be what I think it is," he muttered. Turns out, Dean's great-grandfather had worked this land back in the late 1800s. The creek wasn't just a fishery. It had been part of a now-forgotten mining claim during a short-lived gold rush that fizzled out before it got famous. Local lore said he'd buried a strongbox somewhere near the creek after a legal dispute with land surveyors. Everyone figured it was just a story. Until now. We called in a historian from the county museum who confirmed it was, in fact, an early 20th century federal issue lockbox. Inside, we found old documents, original land grants, handwritten maps, even correspondence with the government regarding water rights and mineral claims. There was also a velvet pouch containing a few coins dated 1872, still gleaming after all those years underground. The historian nearly fainted. Not only did the documents strengthen the creek's protected status, they also proved that parts of the surrounding land had once been considered federally significant. That meant any attempt to alter, build on, or redirect the area could be subject to even stricter oversight. The irony wasn't lost on us. Karen had tried to control the creek and, in doing so, had exposed the very history that made it untouchable. Word spread fast. The county declared the area a historical conservation site. A small plaque was installed near the bend in the stream where we found the hatch, recognizing the contributions of early settlers and the environmental significance of the waterway. Local schools started planning field trips. The creek wasn't just a backyard feature anymore, it was a living piece of history. As for Karen, her house eventually went up for sale. Rumor had it she moved to Arizona to recenter herself spiritually, though some claimed she was last seen trying to argue with a park ranger at the Grand Canyon. Bryce, her flamboyant attorney, rebranded as a litigation wellness coach, and opened a podcast that lasted 3 episodes before disappearing into obscurity. Life went on. Dean and I went back to fishing on Saturdays, now joined by curious kids and the occasional science teacher. Mabel still chased frogs, still never caught a single one. And the creek, finally left in peace, ran clearer than ever. One morning, standing by the water, I watched the sun break through the trees, turning the surface into gold. I thought about everything, the fences, the arrests, the concrete, the night vision goggles, and I smiled. Because no matter how hard Karen had tried to claim it, reshape it, dominate it, the creek had outlasted her. It always would.